Toxic femininity is worse than toxic masculinity. In recent years we have seen a rise in complaints relating to the behavior of men and how it can be construed as toxic. The current movements have brought a deeper focus towards this and have created changes, some for the better and some for the worse. But during this time the very people marching against men have completely ignored their own toxic behaviors, and a failure to address these would be worrisome. Women seem to want equality, but do not want to change their own bad behaviors. When you think of toxic masculinity, you are primarily speaking about mansplaining, manspreading, sexual violence, or the boys will be boys argument. The whole movement seems to target the role of men as the dominant sex, and #X200B. But when you look at toxic femininity, there is a much wider scope of problems that show up. A lot of toxic behaviors can easily outweigh most of what these people consider to be toxic masculinity. A few examples being blaming behavioral issues on periods, acting helpless at times where some physically demanding or unpleasant task comes up, coercing men into sex who didn't seem to really want it and feeling as though you were at liberty to do so because men always want it. Backed up by studies, women are far more likely to threaten harm to themselves, others, or property if a man attempts to leave a relationship. Being physically abusive to men while expressing men can't hit women, and being less likely to face any legal consequences for doing so. Lying about pregnancies or being on birth control to see how a man would respond or to manipulate them into staying. Manipulating divorce and custody battles by falsely insisting that a man has been abusive to you or a child, and #X200B. Some of these examples are minor toxic offenses, like blaming bad behavior on hormones. It's normal, it happens, but it is no excuse all the same. Some of these examples are major toxic offenses, such as using your gender or children as a weapon to influence decision to go your way. One of the most common offenses of toxic femininity is attempting to convince the world that toxic femininity does not exist, and #X200B. Edit. Thanks for the constructive discussions happening instead of comment bashing. Toxic anything is probably not great. I find that using both terms is just a mess. Both genders have their goods and bads. Do we really need to make this a battle between toxic A and toxic B? Seems more divisive than anything. In my opinion, the real problem is the emergence of primitive personality traits that have been controlled for thousands of years through traditional cultural practices and morality. Almost everything that is labeled as toxic masculinity or toxic femininity has never been acceptable behavior, and has been growing in society because we have torn down the culture that kept it under control. I'm not advocating for returning to traditional values and beliefs, just pointing out that we removed many of them without introducing anything to take their place. When I think of toxic masculinity, I think more of the negative affect on men than manspreading. Indoctrinating boys to be stoic, unemotional creatures is terrible for their mental health. Or you could just ignore all the bullshit and be a person who does things because it makes sense to you. All this media hyped buzz language makes me want to gouge me eyes out with spoons. Toxic femininity in my mind is things like taking responsibility for others' emotions, denying yourself to make someone else happy, the ironically named having it all, which just means you have to work like you don't have children and raise your children like you don't work too, accepting that menial tasks will become your job, grocery shopping, unless he wants to do them, cooking, avoiding confrontations to your own detriment such as negotiations because you see standing up for yourself as an aggressive act that will put you in a lower position in the other person's eyes. These are the things I was socialized to that I compare to the things men struggle with. Toxic masculinity, can't ever appear hurt or scared or sad or show affection or talk about your problems and self-worth dependent on net worth type of shit. The problem isn't that toxic femininity is worse than toxic masculinity. The problem is that our society not only accepts but promotes both behaviors. I've been in a relationship where the woman would physically abuse me whenever she was upset. Punch me, throw a laptop, etc. I never once hit her. One day after she hit me so many times she fractured my orbit, I told her I was calling the cops and she got ready to start hitting herself and told me she'd tell the cops I attacked her. I backed down and slept in my best friend's garage that night. I don't know if this is toxic femininity, but women aren't taught not to hit men the same way men are told never to hit women. More than 80% of men claim to be hit first and almost 70% of women admit they hit first in domestic abuse cases. This means that a majority of domestic abuse cases are the result of women being physical first. This doesn't excuse men hitting back, but it's very telling of our culture. Men are truly considered disposable. For this is deleted, because y'all can't behave. While I agree with most of your bullets, the first one is a bit iffy depending on what you mean by it. Anybody is going to be more irritable and snappy if they're in pain. I think if we're being objective here, the two are tied together. The stereotypical or traditional ideas of masculinity or femininity can box people into different paths in life. I really don't think women blaming behavior on their periods is a real issue. We still have attitudes in society, ones not as popular in the first world, that men have to be the breadwinners, macho, etc. And women have to be the child bearers, and must be more reserved, etc. If anything, we have to move away from generalizations and ideas that women have to be this and men have to be this. That's what I think people are talking about when they refer to toxic masculinity. Not about hating men or masculinity, but more about how society expects people to act based on their gender. Toxic masculinity is legit the most misunderstood thing in the world to people that want to say but men have it hard too. Yeah, we do. Toxic masculinity makes it harder. I'm going to be that guy and point out that your definition of toxic masculinity is a bit off. The victims of toxic masculinity are other men. Boys will be boys, acceptance of violence, yes, but also boys don't cry, repression of emotions, and don't act gay, macho conformity of expression. The other things you mentioned, mansplaining, manspreading, sexual violence against women, are toxic acts by men. But they are not toxic masculinity. I really don't see a point in trying to prove that one is worse than the other. They are both problems, why try to downplay one? We can accept them both as problems. Toxic masculinity isn't men acting toxic, it's the term for the societal expectations set on men, like don't cry, don't be fat, etc. Neither is worse than the other. Toxic is toxic. That's just called being a shitty person. If you are a man or woman behaving obnoxiously or abusively, suddenly it's toxic masculinity/femininity. It's kind of absurd to me. Instead of assigning blame based on genders, just be polite and kind to each other. For every example you posted, there's a much, much worse, more violent example of toxic masculinity. No one disagrees toxic _anything _ is bad, but this is a false equivalence post if I've ever seen one. White racism is worse than black racism. Followed by a bullet point list of examples how white people suffered, ignoring all the YAAI worse bullshit black people suffer. I don't know if this is femininity or societal in general, but there seems to be a huge shift towards blaming culture for people's failures instead of the individual. It's men's fault that females can't achieve equality in the workplace. It's white men that hold minorities back from reaching the upper echelons of society. It's men's fault for __________. This seems to deeply rooted in the women's rights movement. Growing up, I was always told life isn't fair, and to use my advantages whenever possible. I think most successful people share this trait, i.e. take ownership of everything. Your employee fuck up? That's your fault because you didn't teach him correctly. Even if it's not technically correct, this attitude puts you firmly in control of your emotions and decisions, and allows you to lead in difficult situations. Anyone can learn either behavior, unpopular, and it's not even close. This dummy seems to think toxic masculinity is a recent discovery. 90% of history and culture has been reamed and ruined by toxic masculinity since the dawn of human beings. I don't think it's fair to compare them. I think on both sides there are very toxic people, neither sex is superior or less toxic. There's shitty people, great people, and people who are somewhere in the middle on both sides. While this post is close-minded, it highlights in itself toxic masculinity. What the hell are those actual stereotypes? You are the one that made up that those are toxic femininity. It's men who tend to blame a woman's bad mood on her period, not a woman herself. Sure, both sides are bad, but there's no reason to play the this one is worse game like the oppression Olympics. I'm super glad you listed what you consider to be characteristics of toxic femininity, but are those things that actual women do? Not a single woman in my life that I know does that. Maybe one or two I've known over the last 30 plus years have done one or two. Gonna have to go with how can it be worse when it's not a widespread issue. I have a few everyday acts of toxic femininity for you. Not responding to what you said, but to what she thinks you meant. Digging up the past even if you apologized, no forgiveness. Making a big deal out of nothing, not seeing the forest for the trees. Control freak behavior. Trying to change people all the time. Hell has no fury but a woman scorned, boundless hate. There probably are more. Frankly, I don't see the point in comparing toxic things. We know they're toxic. Why are we trying to see which is worse? A woman is more likely to harm themselves if their partner leaves. A man is more likely to murder their partner if they attempt to leave. Or scar their face with acid or knives. I think the toxic masculinity is much worse. Sorry. An extreme toxic woman is less likely to cause fatalities like a man would. That's why most murderers, pedos, mass shootings, serial killers are men. Don't get me started on any other country outside of America and Europe. Women far more oppressed and toxic femininity does not exist there. Baby girls murdered because boys are preferred in many countries. Women murdered because they were raped. Women forced to wear burqas by insecure men. Women honor killed because they wanted to just be who they wanted to be. Women treated like property. Child brides given to 40-something men. Women beaten and killed if they attempt to leave. The list goes on. Mind sharing links to the studies/evidence that support these claims. I wouldn't normally ask as the sub is meant to be opinion-based, but you do mention them in your post. Another point I brought up before is that feminists love toxic masculinity when women are exhibiting it. If you watch any female comic book character in recent movies, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman, etc. Their idea of the empowered female is just a woman exhibiting the traits they refer to as toxic when men do it. Not listening to authority. Not working with others to achieve a mutually beneficial goal. Ignoring the advice of others. Not treating anyone else as her equal, worthy of the same level of respect. Displaying a level of false confidence that would easily be labeled arrogance if it were a man exhibiting the same behavior. I don't believe it's healthy to label something toxic masculinity or toxic femininity because it paints with too broad a brush and opens the doors to misogyny and misandry. Most of these behaviors are exhibited by both genders and should be policed universally rather than labeled with a prejudicial terminology to hide flagrant bigotry.